Okay, this is part 5, I think, and I should be done reading the Assara story somewhere towards the end of part 6. For those of you who are done with my story within a story nonsense, yeah, great. Uh, it's fine. Also, I'm gonna back up a paragraph because I stopped in a weird place. Yeah. When the war ended, the two peoples found they had fought so long as one that they no longer wished to be parted. The people of the Namur kings had little identity they wanted to keep that had not been defined by war, and they had been forever changed by their alliance with the Falcons. Many of the Falcons had grown to love the land and the people they had fought to free as much as their own homeland, and they too found that they were not quite as they were when they had left to fight the Namurs. Many Falcons returned home, and some of the Namur's people went with them, but many also stayed to help form a new state, a place of peace and learning where all who wished to coexist were welcome. They continued to experiment with ways to unite naming and shifting, not for war now, but for the sake of learning. They rebuilt cities, reforested destroyed lands, and brought to light more of the once forbidden knowledge of naming. In the time before the war, it was believed that what the Namur kings had discovered were true names, not just strings of sounds like other words, but remnants of the first language, leftovers from the forge of creation, tools spoken into being at the dawn of time. But as Assara and her allies conquered Namur holds, they also acquired their knowledge, and what she found was sacrilege. Many Namurs claimed to have discovered the one true name for various forces and objects, but as Assara studied their notes, she found that no true names were identical. She found 20 different true names for stone and a dozen for wind, but no Namur's words ever matched another's. There was no intrinsic truth to these names at all. Some worked better than others, certainly, but different names worked better for different people or in different situations, or better described different aspects of a thing which could be worked with. It occurred to her that Namurs were not thieves in the workshop of creation, but tool makers. They were word weavers. They were, as we call ourselves today, idiomancers. As understanding of idiomancy spread throughout Assara's fledgling kingdom, the power of her people grew. Great mages arose even amongst those who were once little valued, young women opening walls as easily as her own daughter had parted flower petals, farmers coaxing their crops into strange bounties out of season, warriors committing impossible feats of bravery daily. All this would have been well, and more than well, but over time they discovered that even this power was beholden to the laws of nature. No action occurs without reaction. You cannot throw a stone into a pond without causing a ripple, and so what one wrought without would eventually become reflected within. The girl who tore down walls began tearing holes in her own flesh as she did so. The farmer with the uncanny crops died of cancer a year later, and the warrior would find their minds so warped that all the world looked like a battlefield and all friends like enemies to be defeated. As with everything else, balance was key to survival. It became clear to Assara that if her people were to not destroy themselves, they would need what the Namurs had never had: formal training. The Namur kings had never worried about the ill effects of their magics, and coming into their power slowly, as Assara had, many had naturally found means as they had learned to vary their uses of naming enough to stave off at least the most extreme of potential consequences. A mason, however, upon learning how to bend stone to their will with words, would not think to offset their use of this power with something less rough or hardening. To complicate matters further, some of Assara's people proved poor stewards of liberty, believing that expression of their own freedom necessitated depriving others of theirs. Absolute freedom was quickly becoming rule by the most powerful, and those once oppressed began to fashion themselves oppressors. Assara and Linneret worked tirelessly to standardize idiomancy and its teachings, and to create a system of governance that guaranteed equivalent freedoms to the most and least powerful, ensuring that all would have access to education and knowledge. No one could own another or hoard resources, and above all, that power would always have checks. Over time, their work paid off, and what we know now as Assoria began to take shape. Their unique skills were, however, still a powerful combination of potential weapons and a source of much attention from the outside world, and over the years they had little peace. It seemed that as soon as one problem was solved or a new invader was driven back, another rose to take their place and test themselves against this new power, or try to steal their knowledge. Each time, the battles became more horrific, more costly. What was worse was that they always decimated their enemies. Assara worried they were losing themselves to this constant violence, as they were forced to do more and more terrible things to protect themselves in attacks they didn't provoke. She especially worried about Fletching, her lover and longtime confidant. Once, when things had seemed particularly desperate, she had told him the word of death. Assara had sworn to herself long ago that this one secret she would tell no one, but she was wounded and could not fight, and there was no other way. Since then, Fletching had become too careless with the word. He was changing, and she did not like what he was changing into. He was colder, more prone to overuse of force. His strategies in battle were no longer weighed with the care for sentient life they once had been. Every time Assara uttered the word of death, a piece of her spoke with her husband's words the pain of her daughter's passing, and Assara swore again that she would never become him. Fletching, though noble and kind, had no such anchor. Thus, each time he spoke death, some of his kindness died with his enemies. Assara worried over these problems, and she knew not what to do. She discussed them with Linneret, and Linneret was at as much of a loss as she. Eventually, Assara called the wisest of the dragons down from the north for counsel, as she had many times before. The dragons were old and very wise, and advised the beastling tribes on matters of importance. They had advised Assara on how to create an egalitarian society, and while the dragons knew little of idiomancy, the first dragon knew much of change, and how to guide it towards growth. She needed advice from people she could trust, people who understood, on how to stop the constant wars. She did not tell Fletching. She knew he would not be receptive to the meeting in his current state, and he was one of the concerns she meant to address. Assara had meant to distract Fletching with an outing to fortify defenses in the east, but the dragons arrived early. As soon as she sensed the dragons approach, she took flight to meet them at the field on the edge of the city where they would land, calling the wind to speed her not by words but by will alone. Things were precarious, and Assara worried what would happen if Fletching should meet them before she did. But she knew before she got there that she was too late. A mile from the field, something changed in the air. Assara reeled as it seemed the sky suddenly went dark. As she righted herself, it took her a moment to realize the sky wasn't dark. It was empty. The beacon of power that had stood out bright as daylight moments before was gone, and for a terrible instant it felt as if the whole sky had turned to yawning chasm, threatening to swallow her up as well. But it wasn't the sky that had done this. As Assara approached the field, her mind recoiled against what she saw, insisted it was some grotesque trick, but she knew this was reality. The dragons were dead. All of them. Their bodies littered the ground across the field. Most appeared to have been killed where they landed. Some died before they could shift back, maybe even before landing, and the great dead husks stared blankly at her from across the expanse of green. The rest were in human form. 3 were close together, and Assara screamed when her eyes lit upon them. It was the first dragon and her companions. She sank to her knees. She had never been sure of the precise relationship of the dragons to the other beastling tribes, but she knew she was now responsible for the deaths of great repositories of wisdom, precious resources as well as friends, and she knew what had killed them. Only one thing could have killed a dragon like this, and since she hadn't done this, that led her to one inescapable conclusion. She wanted to cry, to break down here on the ground and sob herself into the earth and never get up. But there was something she had to do first. She couldn't tell whether she felt worse for the dragons or the falcons or herself, but that didn't matter yet. Nothing mattered yet outside the task at hand, outside the fire in her mind that would consume her being if she didn't find something to quench it on. Yeah, we'll stop there.